I'm now going to introduce Brad Parker, who is an attorney with the Children's Defense for Children International Palestine. He's based in New York and has been involved in this issue of documenting children and the abuses that happen to them for a number of years. This morning, Jennifer and Brad were interviewed by KEPX at 7:30 this morning, so it was a great interview. And Brad will be talking about the legal background and statistics about detained children. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great that there's such a full room to come listen and learn about these issues. I am an attorney, so I will focus on the sort of orienting us all to the legal situation and legal frameworks that go into understanding what the situation is for Palestinian children arrested by Israeli forces. And hopefully when we get to the end of the day, things will become very clear why, starting out with the legal context, the legal framework, in a bit of kind of scope and context to the specific issue of child detention, really add color to the human experience that you'll see through the film and through the perspectives of some of the other panelists for their witness on the ground, interacting with Palestinian children, Palestinian families, Palestinian communities. I'm an attorney. I work with Defense for Children International Palestine. It's a local Palestinian child rights organization. It's the only local Palestinian human rights organization that focuses specifically on children's rights. So we've been around since 1991. We started specifically as a legal aid organization representing Palestinian kids in the Israeli military courts. We expanded the legal services to Palestinian children charged in Palestinian Authority courts. And then in 2000, you could say we became a full-fledged human rights organization with monitoring documentation unit, monitoring and documenting violations against Palestinian children throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. So the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. So we have staff all over the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. We have several offices, and all of that is on our website if you want to know more. So let's just get into it. DCI Palestine, as a Palestinian organization, I am American. I'm from New York. I'm one of 3 international staff at DCI Palestine. We have about 49 full-time staff. So the majority are Palestinians working in their own communities to address issues that Palestinian children face in those communities. We decided in discussions with the American Friends Service Committee, and you'll hear from Jennifer Bing right after me, that we wanted to have more of a presence in the US, right? We have a lot of documentation, a lot of stories from our experience as a human rights organization, and we wanted to increase the reach of those to specific audiences in the US where we felt we hadn't done a good job of interacting with. So we created the No Way to Cheat a Child campaign, which gave us a vehicle to bring these stories and show the human impact of occupation for children to a number of different audiences. So we'll talk more about the campaign as we go through the day, but I just wanted to give that as a brief background. So there's a lot of text up there, but the main thing to know is that the campaign really seeks accountability, right? Accountability for violations against Palestinian children, but also to really challenge the occupation straight on. And that'll become more clear as we go through the day, but keep that in the back of your mind. And if it's unclear how we're doing that, ask questions. Okay, so the Israeli military detention system, right? What is Israeli military law? Anyone? Do we know? How does military law compare to a civil criminal justice system? How's it created? Yeah? By the military, right? So in the West Bank, you have an Israeli military law framework. A military commander has executive, judicial, and legislative authority over the entire area. Right? So there's, Palestinians don't vote for anybody to create the law, they don't vote for anybody to implement the law. The law is created by a military commander, as easy as writing a military order out on a piece of paper, signing it, and that becomes part of the law. So since 1967, when the Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, there's been about 1,780 or so military orders issued by the Israeli military. And so these are laws that govern Palestinian life, right? All aspects of it. The military law criminalizes organizing, or groups of people, right, coming together basically for meetings, right, political oriented, anything that could be considered banned by the Israeli military. Give you a sense, I mean, pretty much all Palestinian political parties are illegal organizations under the Israeli military law. For the issue that we'll be talking about today, the specific military order is Military Order 1651. The name of it is Order Regarding Security Offenses. Right? So in some ways, it resembles a typical criminal code that you would see here in Seattle, anywhere in the US. You have assault, you have homicide, a number of different offenses. But you also have more occupation-related offenses, right? So there's a specific charge for throwing stones, right? So if we go out, in the church parking lot, and I pick up a stone and throw it at Mary's car, right? I break the window. Maybe I throw it at Mary. We had a fight. She didn't give me the coffee as fast as I wanted it. Whatever it might be, right? I don't get pulled into court or arrested for the conduct of throwing that stone, right? It's assault, battery, something else. In the Israeli military law, a specific charge, throwing stones. You throw a stone. How many people have been to the West Bank? Right? How many people have seen the concrete separation wall? So if I throw a stone at that wall, I don't have to hit it. If I do hit it, I don't have to cause any damage. That comes with a potential 10-year maximum sentence under the Israeli military law. Right? If I throw a stone into traffic or a moving object, right, I don't have to hit it, I don't have to cause any damage, no harm. That comes with a potential 20-year maximum sentence under military law. Right? So it gives you an idea of sort of the scope of these offenses and then the ramifications of those. And to give a sense of the broadness of the military law, there's specific charges for conduct towards soldiers. So there's an offense of assaulting a soldier. It comes with a 7 or 10-year maximum sentence. And the lesser charge really, I think, sums up, so, if you're a lawyer, if you're not a lawyer, this charge sort of sums up the purpose and intent of the military law, right? So insulting the honor of a soldier, right, comes with a potential 1-year maximum sentence. So if you can tell me what that means in any concrete, practical way, where I, as a Palestinian child, as a Palestinian man, going through a checkpoint, right, daily, does that mean not showing my ID fast enough? Smiling at the soldier, is that insulting his honor? So essentially, the takeaway is that anybody could be arrested for anything, or at any time by the Israeli forces. There's no requirement for warrants, so soldiers have the authority to arrest anybody that they suspect has violated one of the security provisions. As you can imagine, with no oversight over arrest, that could be fairly problematic for a number of different communities. Right? Communities located near settlements, near checkpoints, near the separation wall, right? Anywhere where the occupation has its infrastructure, military presence, a settler presence. These are the communities most impacted and targeted for arrest, particularly children. The military courts, right? Kids arrested in the West Bank, they find themselves in one of 2 military courts operating in the West Bank. If you're in East Jerusalem and you're, a 15-year-old child, because Israel treats Jerusalem as part of Israel, they apply Israeli civilian law, right? So you have added protections in East Jerusalem. But what we find is that those are discriminatorily applied to Palestinian children. So even though there are increased protections, in practice, Palestinian children don't necessarily have those rights afforded to them. So just quickly to give a sense of what these kids encounter, this gives you a visual. So this is Offer Military Court. It's a military base. Inside is a court and a prison. So anywhere from 40 to 55% of Palestinian children in detention at any moment are held here behind those concrete walls. The court is inside, and this is what a military court looks like. So they're temporary sort of construction containers, or if you go to a job site construction somewhere, right? You have the office that's just a trailer that's plopped down. This is what these are, right? They're small. Palestinian families sit in the back. They can't touch their children. They can't hug them. They can't really talk to them. Kids are brought in, sat in the chairs, right, and then ushered out the door. There's no human interaction between families and children. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, what children face when they're arrested. So we've been documenting these violations essentially since we started in 1991, and there's a very clear pattern that comes out of the documentation and the testimonies from children. So there's an arrest. Often arrests happen in the middle of the night. Right? Heavily armed soldiers come to the home, bang on the door, enter the home, sometimes force their way in, gather the family in usually one room, ask for identification, check IDs, and if your name is on the intelligence officer's list, you're ushered out of the home. You're bound with plastic tie around your wrists, behind your back, blindfolded, and usually walked to a military jeep. We just released a report in April that looks at our documentation from 2012 through the end of 2015. And those figures show that 3 out of 4 kids face some form of physical violence following arrest. Right? So it could be anything from slapping, pushing, hitting, kicking, to being hit with a helmet, struck with a rifle, minor injuries to serious injuries. Really, what happens during that arrest and transfer period, it would shock you, the range of different ways that kids can be abused. So you're out of your home, bound, blindfolded, you've suffered some physical abuse, and now you're in the back of a military jeep, bound and blindfolded, you don't know where you're going, don't know where you're being taken. For many of these children, it's the first time they've been away from their families alone, and they're in the back of a military jeep. Kids often first arrive at a military camp or a military base near their village, sometimes at a military base inside a settlement nearby. If you're arrested, say, at 2 a.m. from your home, you might arrive at that military base at 3 a.m., pulled out, put on the ground, bound and blindfolded, just waiting for what comes next. Generally, kids are taken about 8, 9 a.m., sometime that morning, to an Israeli police station in one of the settlements, where they find themselves in an interrogation room, sitting across a table from an Israeli interrogator. Right? No access to counsel, no parents present. They've been arrested from their home in the middle of the night, bound, blindfolded, right? This is an extremely vulnerable situation they find themselves in. And I think, reading these testimonies and talking with these children, I think of myself in New York. I got into a car accident a few years ago, back probably 2013. Driving down Broadway near my apartment, and a car comes across, ran a red light, and collided with me. He was an older man, and he was visiting his son. He was trying to park, and it was rainy, and he didn't really know where he was. And the son was worried that, we were doing something shady with insurance because he didn't want to report it to insurance, et cetera, et cetera. They called the police. The police officer comes to the door, and it's a harmless situation. But I have this officer at my door, and you just feel the nerves. And I imagine, the situation that these kids find themselves in, and it's almost incomprehensible, right, for the reality that I live in and the privilege that we have here. So these kids often confess or don't confess, right? The majority of kids end up pleading guilty because it's the fastest way to get out of the system. Interrogations tend to be coercive. So in a system where you don't have warrants, you don't have independent oversight over arrests, that interrogation becomes the vehicle for creating something that could be used to charge that child in the military court, right? So even if a child, doesn't confess to throwing stones, often that statement that gets typed up by the interrogator will have something that's incriminating that would allow the military prosecutor to file charges against him. Kids' first time that they see a lawyer is often in the military court after the interrogation. It could be up to 2, 3, 4 days later. And that's their first interaction with an attorney. And by that time, so DCI represents these kids. In the majority of cases, the first time we see them is in that courtroom. There's not much you can do, right? And this is important, right? The military court system isn't a justice system, right? It's not necessarily intended to hold individuals accountable for criminal conduct, right? The military court system, if you arrest kids from their home in the middle of the night, you deny them access to counsel, you ill-treat and physically abuse 3 out of 4 kids, this isn't a system that's interested in justice. Right? This is all about control. And when you see where the arrests and where these kids are taken from, they're communities that are located near settlements, near military bases, near roads used by soldiers and settlers, and communities that are weekly demonstrating against the confiscation of their land, the root of the separation wall, etc. Right? And when you see it on a holistic level, it's not about individual conduct, right? It's really about control. Because it doesn't actually matter if you've thrown a stone or not. You could be arrested either way, right? So I wanted to just turn a little bit to sort of, where we are right now. So over the past several years, things had been pretty, I'll say, steady. Right? Ill treatment has been sort of identified as widespread and systematic and institutionalized within the Israeli military detention system. And DCI Palestine has been saying it for over 14 years. In 2013, UNICEF released a report where they also found that it was widespread and systematic within the Israeli military detention system. But in October 2015, things deteriorated significantly. So if you see, this is just sort of September, there were 171 kids in detention. And that had been sort of a lower figure over the past 2 or 3 years, right? It's usually around 200, and it sort of ebbs and flows up and down a bit. But October saw a tremendous spike. And that sort of carried into the beginning of the year with February, the highest number of kids in detention in a single month since the Israeli Prison Service started releasing figures back in January 2008. Right? Since then, the Israeli Prison Service hasn't released figures. They released figures in April, and I think it was around 416, 420 kids in prison. And since then, we haven't had any new figures as this sort of trend has spiked. There's also been a number of sort of legislative changes, right, over the years. And the main takeaway is that all of the changes in the military law to address these specific issues that have been raised in the international community and put pressure on the Israeli military authorities to address ill treatment and the way that they carry out arrests have really all been cosmetic, right? So I'll give 2 quick examples. After a number of years complaining and mobilizing on the international level to draw attention to the fact that within Israel, in the civil system, the age of a child was 18, and in the Israeli military law system, the age of a child was defined as 16 and under, right? So under 16, right? So the Israeli civilian system, under 18 was the age of child, and the military system it was under 16, right? So after several years, they eventually changed the military law to be in line with the Israeli civilian law. So the definition of a child was any person under 18 years old, right? It's a success, but it didn't actually affect anything, right? So as it stands now, that change in that military law didn't affect sentencing provisions. So if you are a 16 or 17-year-old, you can still be sentenced as an adult, right? So a lot of the changes are very sort of cosmetic. They look good, but they don't actually have any impact. One of the more recent military orders is one that would require video recording of interrogations, and for the interrogation to be conducted in the language of the child, right? So it's good. This is something we've been pushing for. Lots of different people have been pushing for it. But at the end of that military order, there's a clause that says this military order will not apply to security offenses. So throwing stones, right, remember? Throwing stones is in the order regarding security provisions. It is a security offense. This is the majority of kids are charged with throwing stones. So this order really doesn't apply to any of the children, right, that experience the physical violence and all of the different ill treatment that happens. And that sort of gives you a sense of where things are. So maybe I'll stop there.
All right. My name's Jennifer Bing, and I work for the American Friends Service Committee, and it's fun to be in Seattle and see some of my old colleagues and friends over the years. For those of you who aren't familiar with the American Friends Service Committee, we're about to celebrate our 100th year, so that's pretty exciting. And we are probably one of the oldest U.S. peace organizations in terms of being engaging on the issue of Israel and Palestine, starting back to 1948 when Quaker volunteers went into Gaza and helped with the Palestinian refugee issue. So we've had a long tenure. I can say I wasn't alive in 1948, but I feel like I've been working on this issue about that long. Well, one of the things when I take groups to Palestine and Israel is, and people who feel like they're well-read and so forth will say, wow, there's so many kids here. You see kids in the streets, you see kids selling things, you see kids running up to you in the refugee camps, and they're just everywhere. And that is real. 46% of the population, of Palestinian population in Gaza and West Bank are children under the age of 18. So when we talk about the issue of child detention and children going through the process of military courts and so forth, we are talking about a majority of the population. My first visit to Israel and Palestine was back in 1982, and at that time, one of my first experiences where I was the American college student and studying conflict resolution, and yeah, I thought I knew a lot until I went there. So probably many of you had that same experience of thinking you kind of knew the situation, and then you get there and you're like, whoa, I didn't know that. I didn't know about skunk water. I didn't know the wall would look that big or whatever. For me, the first one of my experiences was being present for a night raid. I was visiting, I was helping harvest the olives. I don't know, some of you may have done that with Bears 8 students, and we were in a village, and I didn't speak any Arabic at the time, and so I was trying to communicate with my host family, and the young women were wearing the hijab, and when we got home, they whipped it off, and they had tight jeans on, and they put on music, and we're dancing around. I'm like, whoa, cultural experience, and we're just enjoying ourselves. Somebody said Palestinian hospitality. That is something that just is there. And we're in this moment when all of a sudden we hear gunshots and screaming, and the family that I was staying with all of a sudden forgot they had a guest, and they were shooing the boys out the back of the door, and the mother was screaming and trying to hold her children, and I was kind of like, okay, what's going on here? And I went out to the veranda, and I sat and looked, and I could see the shooting, and soldiers were running around, and I looked, and I saw the army jeep sitting right there, and on the side it said U.S. Army. And I thought, this isn't just about Israelis and Palestinians. This is about me and about my responsibility to this conflict. And I imagine most of you in this room today have that same feeling, that once we've witnessed this, once we've seen the human rights violations, once we see the risks that people take just to stay in their country, that we can't let it go. So what I'm excited about with this campaign is that it's become a vehicle where many of us can talk to people that maybe when we say, oh, I'm really concerned about the situation in Israel and Palestine, they kind of like, oh, you know, that it's intractable and you can't, it'll never be, there's nothing I can do, and oh, nobody's going to listen to me, or I'm going to lose all my friends if I bring it up. And yet, when you start talking about kids and the amazing role that they play in their families and in their resistance and in their life and in conditions that we wouldn't want our own children to be in, by telling those stories, I think it helps break down something. I don't know what it is, but it's been exciting to us in this campaign to have conversations, even with members of Congress, who they've heard us say, end the occupation. They've heard us say, let's stop sending weapons and military aid that make the situation work. They've heard us say that for decades. But what they haven't heard us say is, you know, this is what it means to live under military occupation. This is what it means to live with the knowledge that at any point the army could break into your house and grab your 12-year-old son out of bed, and you can't do anything about it. And when you start the conversation there, Brad and I found, and people around the country have been finding, that it starts a conversation about rights, it starts a conversation about human beings and what we all should have as, you know, in terms of rights and what everyone hopes for their own kids. So the film that I'm setting up for you was made because we, 2 years ago when we conceived of this campaign, and it was a group kind of like some of you in this room and sitting in Chicago saying, we're tired of doing the same old thing. We see that there's a shift in public opinion on this issue, and there's so many exciting boycott and divestment campaigns, and like it seems ready that maybe we could find a way to start talking to Congress. And we weren't sure that was actually true, but we came up with this idea, and we thought, you know what would be really important is for people to hear from the kids themselves. All of you who have been in this room and you've gone and you've sat in people's homes and they've told you their stories, that's what motivates you. That's what keeps you involved, and it transcends all the stereotypes that people have. And so let's bring some kids' voices to Capitol Hill. Let's have them listen to what it's like to be a kid living under military occupation. And so we had hopes of doing that. And then kind of reality set in, and it's like, well, how do we get the visas, and how can they come when they're in school, and kids who have been through the military justice system, unlike in this country when you're 18 and your record is wiped clean, once you've been through the military court system, you're tagged. You have your ID is a different color, and so it became a challenge for us to think about how do we bring kids. And then when talking to families about, so, hey, how'd you like your son to come to the United States and speak to members of Congress in Washington, D.C.? And they're like, no, no thanks. Especially nowadays when we're like, yeah, well, look at our political system. Not exactly welcoming to Muslims all the time. But anyway, but we still felt it was important that people hear the stories. So 2 volunteers with American Friends Service Committee, retired people who have worked with Christian peacemaker teams and have spent time in Hebron and know the area somewhat, said, Jennifer, we'll go and we'll collect footage. We'll work with Defense for Children International Palestine, and we'll record some of these stories because we know the families. We know we know what they're facing, and we think that we could get people to trust us and talk about their experiences. And so we kind of took a gamble. They went, and they have white hair, and so they didn't have any problem getting through checkpoints and things like that. They were very nervous, though. And they met with different families for the boys that are featured in our film, and working with the field workers and with the families and with Joyce and John and the filmmaker, we're able to tell some very compelling stories, we think. I want to say that all of them, for a couple of these young men, young boys, this was the first time they'd talked publicly to somebody about their experience. All of them knew that we were making this film because we wanted members of Congress to hear their story.
Children are detained, blindfolded, handcuffed. They don't know their rights. Most of the time they sign papers they can't read.
It is an experience that stays and lives with the child.
For 3 days, you don't know where your child is, if he's dead or alive, or what's happened to him, what crime did he commit. You don't know anything. And then after the child is released, the families become overprotective. The Israelis issued some guidelines and rules to honor the international standards, yet in practice, we don't see this happening. Most of the time, they don't honor these guidelines and rules.
ليلة الاعتقال كان أبوي يشتغل في الأرض، قام علي قال لي تعال ساعدني، فجيت عليه كان في مواجهات، بعديها رحت أتفرج، ما وعيت إلا بطلع لي كلب.
في صوت خبط باقي، طلعت الجندي بصحفي بيقول لي قوم يا حبيبي تعال معنا. الحين أنا أول ما يشوف الواحد بني آدم بشوف إشي اللي يطمن منه، مش أول ما يشوف يطلع له جندي مع سلاح وتغيير اللي يرعبك.
شو كيف مسكوك؟
زغط أجا من تحت الشجرة.
يعني أنت ما كنت شايفهم؟
نعم.
لكن من جندي مسكك؟
4.
4. وكيف حطوك جوا الجب؟
دخلنا أول شيء على المستعمرة. قعدت على ما كنت شايف شو تحتي، بس كان كتر
ضرب.
جزر السنة أنا تريح دائما من فوق من برد بيعطش ينادي علي، فما رضيتش أرد عليه، ضليتني ماشي يعني قد ما قدرت أشد أنفد منهم نفدت ما قدرتش، لما لحقني لما جاء علي شتاني من رقبتي أخذنا على البرج، حاطني في البرج وكلبشني في كلبشات بلاستيك، قاعد جاب كاسة مي حبة حلو قعدت أنا بجيب ضابط بتمبر مسؤول عن بتمبر، بلش يقول لي اهدى انت الحين وإن شاء الله تروق من هالحكي. طلع من هنا جت سسية أخذتني عالسيون.
حتى نجي الدكاترة وأول إشي عالجوا الكلب، شافوا أسنانه كيف عض الأمير وهذا، عالجوا الكلب، وبعدين الأمير مسكوه وزتوه في الجيب.
لبست جهازة حالي وكلبشوا لي إيدي يعني، ظلت نازل غطوا لي على عيني، ركبت في السيارة على أساس إنهم يعني يودوني يعتقلوني خلص.
له هذا ولد صغير عمره 10 سنة ونص، يعني شو هذا ساوى؟ لا بقول أنا بدي معي المخابرات. قلت له هذا شو ساوى في جيش دولة إسرائيل؟ أنتوا كلكم خايفين من هذا؟ طب راجع كلبش لي إياه، كلبش شو بدي؟ قلت له أنتوا يعني شو هذا شو سواك وشو أنتوا شو الخوف اللي بسبب لكم يا عبد الرحمن؟ يعني ما سوى شيء ابني في الصف التاسع ملتزم في مدرسته طلاب الشطار، زائد أنا في عندي شوية شغل في الدار، في شوية تصليحات في الدار بشتغل وهي معي بيشتغل.
بلشت سياسة الضرب يعني في السيارة من بكوس مش ليط يعني أي شيء يخبطوا فيا يعني لدرجة إنه وجع من جنابي يعني، فأكثر من ضربة أجتني.
رحت على سجن في عسيون، قبل السجن رحت على تحقيق ثاني يوم الصبحية بعد المستشفى رجعوني هنا على كرم السورة المستوطنة. ظليت غادي نايم.
وين كنت نايم؟ كيف كنت نايم؟
بقيت نايم هيك جوا وأنا قاعد
بالجيب ولا؟
لا ما أعرف شوي، بس بقيت معصب.
أخذتوا لي على عينيا الحين بلشوا الحين أنا حطوني في زاوية الجب من جوا. الجنود الحين إحنا بين رجليهم يعني بلشوا يضربوا فينا برجليهم، أنا وعدة شباب من المخيم يعني اعتقلونا، فبلشوا بالضرب يعني 5 دقايق هم بيضربوا فينا بعد توصلنا المستوطن، يعني لو ما أبعد لا طولوا معنا. بعدها حطونا طبعا مغطينا عينينا كلباشين، شبحونا يعني تقريبا 3.5 كيجي، شبحونا وعروسة صبعنا يعني.
بدنا تجيب حملنا 2 ودونا على مركز في المستعمرة، سألني شو اسمك وقديش عمرك، قعدنا هنا، بعدين صار يضرب علي في حجار.
كيف يضرب عليك؟
قاعد أنا قبالهم هم يضرب علينا حجار.
كانوا الحجار يجوا فيك. أنت كنت
مكلبش
مغمض عيونك ما كنت شايف شيء،
وكان رايح وجاي يضرب. بعد يمكن 5 ساعات جينا وطلعنا على السوق.
وانا هيك الحين ما بقدرش ادافع عن نفسي لانه انا مربط من ايدي ورجلي ومغطى على عيني، يعني اي واحد بيضربني من ورا بعرفش منه هو، فبلش يضربوا فيا بشكل يعني بهمجي، بدهم يعني كانوا بدهم يقتلوا الواحد. بعدها ركبت في الجيب اخرى مره ودونا على مركز التحقيق.
The main philosophy of interrogation is to exert as much as pressure on the person who is under interrogation and keep his resistance as low as possible.
ودونا مركز التحقيق، يعني تلاقيت مع أكثر من ضابط، بلشوا يحققوا معي، يقولوا لي تعال تخافش بدناش نضربك، احكي عن اللي صار معك، اعترف على الشباب اللي كانوا معك ومن روحك.
بعدين صار يدخل جنود وعشان يخوفني.
مم.
وإيش كان التحقيق؟
شو كان يحكي لك؟ شو كان يسألك؟
كان يقول لي اعترف إنك بتضرب وعشان أروح.
مم.
قلت له ما فيش علي شيء عشان أروح.
مم.
قلت له أنا ما ضربتش.
مم.
قبل لي أنت بس اعترف وعسى بروح. قلت له لو ضربت بقول لك بس ما ضربتش.
كان خلاص دخلت عند مشرف عن حالات الزينة، وبلش يحكي معي وبدي أنا يعني أعترف. وأنا أول مرة ما اعترفتش، طلعت وأخذنا عن المستوصف، يعني تقريبا في 2 كيلو من هذا المستوصف 4 مرات أخذنا مرجعني مشي. آخر مرة دخلت على المشرف بلش يحقق، أنا ما أدري ظليت منبد معه. لو بدخل لي واحد طويل وضخم لو بضربني على رجلي، فعودت اعترفت على حجري.
بده يعني احكي اشي ما عملتوش عشان قبلي حاله وقبلي غيري، فانا بقول له يعني احكي اشي مش عامله انا، يعني اشي صعب هذا على البني ادم. فاضطر انه يصير يضربني، مسكني من راسي وخبط راسي في الطاولة وضربني هنا بوكس عبطني.
كان في شخص واحد يحقق بدون جواب جنبه، بعدين دخل كمان شخص إلى سوالف وبطاقية، هذاك كان يمد ايده ويضرب، استخدم الضغط النفسي اشتري شيء. بعد كده باخذ اخوك، بجيب اهلك، بهد الدار، بسوي اي شيء. يعني وصلت اني اقول لي انا بدي اطلع اخذ اخوك الحين.
زي ما استبدت دخل علي على القسم، شرحت له القصة هيك القصة وصار معي هيك يعني، ولا صار شيء يعني. اجت واحدة واجه واحد علي، دخل علي عشان يسمع قصة وما سوى شيء. يعني وقفت رجلي، يعني رجلي كمان كانت يعني منفوخة مش رايحة بعد شهر. لما اجوا علي هذول في مؤسسة بيحكوا تفرجوا على رجلي، شاف رجلي مش مسوي ليش، قلت لي عن رجلي، قلت له ايوه شاف رجلي كيف.
بعدين جاب مجلد، كانت في جنازة عندنا في البلد وجاب مجلد، ففتحه قدامي، شفت الصور ما اعترفتش على شيء، كان صور للشباب يعني دون اعترافات ايش. يمكن قعدت 5 دقايق بعد 5 ساعات، بعدين طلعني على البصمات، بصم وترجع التحقيق، بصم وترجع التحقيق. تمنى لقي لي صورة، الأخير له بقول لي روح، بديش اتحقق كمل معك، خلاص روح.
واحد اجاني بقول لي سلم علي، بقول لي انا المحامي تبعك حاليا.
عرف عن حاله ولا؟
لا ما عرفش عن حاله.
اسمه؟
قال لي انا المحامي تبعك، ابوك حطني. طبعا انا وظيفتي اني احميك من الاعداء ومن الكلام يعني. قال لي انت عارفك فلسطيني زيك، اعترف على اشي بسيط وبروحك يعني. اعترف لك مثلا 2 3 وروح. بقول له كيف يعني احكي اشي مش عامله انا؟ عارفك محامي تبعي، بحكي لك الاشي اللي صار معي، اكذب عليك؟ ما انت محامي تبعي دافع علي. لو بقولك لي قال صار بده يضربني، استغربت انا من اسلوبي، يعني المحامي ما بضرب، المحامي بيدافع عنك. اجى بتضربني الا بقولك لي اذا ما بتترفش بس جيناك 6 شهور.
وبلش يقول شلح الأواعي، بلش يفتش الأواعية وهذا. أنا قال أنا مشلح، طلعت على البوسطة، طلعنا في البوسطة وأنا مشلح، ظليت تقريبا 4 ساعات في البوسطة. 4 ساعات يعني تجمدت، يعني صرت ثلج هذا. وبلشت أخبط البوسطة عشان يفتح لي، ولا حياة من المتنادي. وصوت وقيمة حوط آخر شيء، فتح الباب بقوة، فتح علي يجد يضربني. فأنا يعني سكت، مش خاسني. فقلت له سقان، ودرج بلشت أحكي معه، قلت له سقان، قلت تعال وراي. يعني أنا مشلح ورحت وراه وجاب لي بنطلون البلوزة. أنا وقتها كنت لابس بنطلون رياضة نص شي وبضي يعني دقيقة، يعني مش تبت الواحد يتسلج على فيها.
When they put a Palestinian child in solitary confinement, this child will be ready to give a confession when the Israeli interrogator interrogates him, because he wants to get rid of this situation.
We pass out brochures to them to know more about their rights. when they're detained by the Israeli army. We also tell them some, a few stories and of what happened to other children.
طلعنا على عصيون، مشيت يمكن حوالي 5 كيلو وأنا مكلبش ومغمض بدون ما أشوف إشي.
ودوني على هذا غرفة صغيرة زي الزنزانة، شبيب الزنزانة، أكل ممنوع، ريحة كريهة، شبابيك ما في شي، وأكثر من واحد بيكون، وأمرات بحطك لحالك، يعني بتعرف كيف بدك تقضي وقتك، ودنيا سقعة، وإذا بدك تنام ما بتقدرش، مش لابس إشي. هذا يعني خلاني إني يعني ما أنامش، إنه أجتني فترة يعني أضلني نايم في الدار، ما أقومش يعني من كثر من التعب بعد ما أروح من السجن.
طبعا في ال40 يوم هذول 14 محكمة حضرنا إلها، هي مسجلات مع الأستاذ إياد مسك 14 محكمة حضرنا.
كانت فترة صعبة يعني كل شيء مذل، خاص نص إن قضينا رمضان يعني كانت فترة صعبة، ومع وضع غزة اللي صار وقتها زادوا علينا الضغط جوا، يعني كل شيء بذل، الأكل الخربان من تاريخه كله يجب بس.
قاعد ما يوم فجأة واحدة على الساعة يعني تقريبا 6 الصبح لو جيني شحروف، قلت نستنى يعني 8 من المطلعون، أطلعوني من القسم قعدونا في الامتناع تقريبا على 9 الليل. من مطلعونا من الامتناع أعطوا كل واحد اللي إله نظل معاه هناك محكم هناك، أعطونا إياهم وطلعنا وعاودوا رجعونا امتناع. قعدنا من يعني خلصوا مع السكر السجن كلياته، طلعونا على البوسطة وأخذوني يعني ورخونا على البواب توفى. فبدور على اللي فيش حدا اللي ملاقيني، لما باقيين قبل اليوم يستنوا فيا، يعرفوش إن يعني يوم الاثنين بروح. فركبت سيارة ورحت روحت، أنا جيت عليهم دخلت عليهم فجأة يعني ما فيش حدا بعد، وهذا دخلت جي وكملت حياتي.
لبست أواعي السجن، ضلتني في السجن الحين لا أواعي لا دفع، ما فيش يعني وساقع وفيش شبابيك مسكر عليك، لا أكل لا مي.
خلوك تحكي مع أبوك، خلوك تحكي معه.
بحكي له بدي أحكي له مع أبوي، بدي أنا أكل وين أنا، يعني ما بعرفوش وين أنا يعني من حقهم. قال لي لا أنت الحين بحكي أنا معه وعشان نحط لك محامي.
حكموا عليك ولا كيف؟ إيش حكموا عليك؟
2 شهرين وكفالة.
قضيت الشهرين؟ شهرين وكفالة. قديش الكفالة؟
2000.
2000 شهر.
We notice behavioral changes with children after they get released from detention.
I believe that every child who is interrogated and incarcerated by the Israeli authorities is psychologically affected as a result of this experience. The level of the affection depends on the age of the child when he has been arrested, the methods and techniques of ill treatment and torture used against him, and also the period that he spent inside Israeli prisons, because the life inside Israeli prisons is a very harsh life. More than 60% of Palestinian children are incarcerated in a prison inside Israel, which is against the international law. During their stay in these prisons, especially during the first 3 months, they are not allowed to receive family visits, and also they are not allowed to make telephone calls. And for almost all Palestinian children, this experience is the first experience for them to be separated from their families.
The children were completely changed. I mean, the way that they react about this, I mean, how they treat their parents well after the detention. I mean, it's something that really affects the respect of the children to his parents, also to his siblings, brothers or sisters, and also to his acceptance of education, and just improving and developing himself. A lot of them, just decided to drop out of school.
حياة الطفل الفلسطيني طبعا كلها خوف وذل وقهر وكل إشي يعني بتعلق فيه، بتعلق التعليم كل ذل وقهر، يعني إشي بجميلة بسووه. والتجربة اللي بخوضها الطفل الفلسطيني مش سهلة.
شعور لا يوصف.
Most of them, they leave their schools. They don't go to schools anymore. They just go to work. Or some of them, they leave from Hebron to live in a faraway village where it's maybe farther from the soldiers and the settlers and all these confrontations, so they can maybe relax and recover from the trauma that they had and that they experience in their life.
Even the image of the father who is right there in the house and is not being able to actually to defend basically his family from these Israeli soldiers is actually for the long run is eroding the vision or the image of the father who is supposedly, you know, protect the family against any danger, while, you know, the kid in the back of his mind, well, the Israeli soldiers came in and he couldn't do anything.
بالنسبة للشعور هو شعور مأساوي. بتحس أولادك يعني مميزين، بتحسهم إنهم بيطيروا منك وما بتفقد السيطرة عليهم. يعني حتى بتحس إنهم بينهاروا قدامك ومش قادر تعمل لهم إشي، وخاصة أمير إحنا عندنا مشكلة مش بسيطة.
إحنا مش عارفين نتصرف معاه.
يعني ولا أي طريقة عارفين نتصرف معاه. يعني شعوري بتمنى يعني على العالم إن يوجهوا رسالتهم بالضغط على إسرائيل بعدم اعتقال الأطفال، لأن الأطفال يعني بيتم معاملتهم في السجن يعني معاملة مش طبيعية.
Okay, first of all, let me introduce several of the members here. You have your sheet there. I will not go into great detail, but let me highlight a few things. Our first guest is Amal Muammar, and she is Palestinian. She grew up in Palestine and came to the U.S. to work on degrees in social work. And so she has spent considerable time in the U.S. She then returned to Palestine, Israel, was lecturing at 2 universities in Jerusalem. She then returned to the States here, has worked with hospice and as a social worker, as a clinical social worker at Seattle Children's Hospital. And in recent years has been in private practice while continuing at the Children's Hospital, private practice in psychotherapy. Second person I'll introduce is Alice Rothchild. She has her training in medicine. For many years was an OB-GYN, physician. And in subsequent years, I'm sure you made many trips to Israel before then, but gained a deep passion for the plight of Palestinians and peace between Palestinians and Palestine. She has written a number of books and produced movies and is very busy as a retired person leading seminars like this and speaking in many settings. She's in the process of writing another book that'll be coming out next year. And Alice is one who brings a great deal of insight from an American Jewish perspective to the Palestinian situation. And then our third speaker is John McKay. He is a law professor, works in government investigations and crisis management, has taught at Seattle University, and primarily has worked in constitutional law and national security law. And that has taken him into many different situations, including working at Guantanamo, as well as spending extended time in Palestine and Israel, teaching students, lawyers, working at the legal aspects of investigations and prosecution, training police officers and Palestinian lawyers. So that's the three additional people in addition to Brad. So let's begin with Amal.
Thank you very much. I am so glad to have the opportunity to do this with everybody. Just to talk a little bit more about my experience in terms of just in working back there. So my focus was, my primary major was social work, and my whole career has been spent on working with families and kids in various areas of life. And it just happened that the focus was in Palestine about a lot of trauma, a lot of program development in refugee camps and urban and rural areas during the first uprising, intifadas in the 80s, where a lot of the men were incarcerated and absent from the family life. So what that did to the family position at that point. So that's where it all started. And then when I came here, I work at Seattle Children's as a clinical social worker, and I work primarily with children and their families who undergo a transplant. So that's also a very traumatic experience to families dealing with kids who are at threat of dying or not living a healthy life, basically. So looking at this, at the movie and listening to the speakers, it took me back. It took me back to think about the families and family consolidation and families' roles in the intricate culture of the Palestinian society. So when I was asked to do this, the person who asked me, he said, I want you to talk about the families. You know a lot about families, although I don't consider myself as an expert on cultural expert on any families other than my own. But the family in Palestinian society is a very important part of the community. It is actually the base of that culture. You have two types. So one is mostly in urban settings where it's just a nuclear family, and then you have the extended family, which sometimes is separate, like they live in rural areas, the nuclear families live in city due to job opportunities, etc. But they're very highly integrated, they're highly connected. And when you talk about a person, individual, it almost doesn't exist without the family. Like when I go back, and I've been out for years, the first question, who's your father, who's your grandfather, who you belong to, who's your uncle, aunt, etc. So you're never perceived as an individual. That's why it's very important when you listen to the kids speaking. One of the kids who spoke about the worst part about the question when he was interrogated is when they threatened him with his brothers, bringing his brother in, and family members, and maybe demolishing their homes or whatever. And that's huge. That's significant to kids growing up there because it is so immersed. They're nothing without that family. So the family, as in all families, they play a role of protection, of securing the everything to your children. They develop your identity and well-being and self-identity and knowing who you are, who you belong to, where you come from, etc. So all of that history is very, very important and very integral part of the development of the child. So when you take that away, that's a huge devastation to the psyche of the person, to the thing that gave them the stability and the security that they stand to become a more functioning adult in the future. So the other piece about the families in Palestine and in the Arab countries in general, it's they look at the children as the wealth. It's considered as the wealth of the family. So the more the merrier. We have large families. They're all related, interrelated, somehow cousins. Everybody's in the family. You don't distinguish between your own and this other person's kids, kind of things. So that's another component. So when I believe Jennifer mentioned something that's one of the most striking things. You go into villages, into streets, it's kids everywhere. And they're running around playing. They come at the end of the day, nobody comes after them to check on them. Nobody has curfews even, their own kids. There's curfews, military curfews, but not in terms of family curfew. And so it's very secure in that sense. So when incarceration happens, it flips. You take that away. You take that security. You take that sense of belonging, especially if they do comply with whatever the accusations are, or if they become collaborators, so to speak. And that's what would be one of the worst, probably, traumatic experience to any child, is because they get taken away from that secure community of theirs. And again, it's not just their own immediate family, it's the whole clan, the whole community, the whole village. So that's the impact of it all. The other thing that what happens, it's as any traumas, it stunts anybody's development. Anybody who goes through it, and it depends on your developmental age, it modifies that in some ways. So for kids, for example, that's the age when they're teenagers, that's when they're like finding their own self, their own identity. They need that independence. And what happens after that, you go back to square one, where your parents or your family becomes more overbearing, more strict about where you go, where you come, so you can't go. It becomes a very isolating kind of, you live in an isolating world in that sense. And that's kind of contrary to the development of that age group at that time. So in terms of incarceration for kids, it goes on many, many levels, not only on the individual, but also in the families. The families become helpless. They become over the top anxious about the security of their children. And Jennifer mentioned one of her experiences, and I've seen that as well, is when you hear either, not sirens, but bullets going off, shootings. The mothers, automatic, everybody, all the adults, they say to the boys, go hide, go somewhere, go up to the roof, whatever it is, to kind of protect them. Because they are your extension. They are the extension of that family, boys and girls alike, but mostly boys because they're more targeted at that point. So that's why the impact of incarceration on kids, it's not just that. It is the impact of that on the whole society, on the parents, and you've seen it in the movie where the mother is sitting by her child just beside herself. And you could see from the body language how traumatic that experience to her. The little girl who was sitting, the sister, I'm assuming, to the boy who was talking about his experience. And she was scared. She looked very, very scared. So that's secondhand trauma. That is going to continue. There is no way you could prevent that. And it's alive. It goes on and on and on, and there is no end to it. And that's where it's very important for initiatives like this and similarly advocacy, where we have to have a stop to it because it is a vicious cycle. Aggression produces aggression. It impacts kids, it impacts how they perceive themselves mentally, emotionally, intellectually, cognitively, etc., on all levels, because it stunts that part of their development.
Thank you, Amal. You bring back two vivid recollections for me. I was there for 7 weeks. Two things stood out: hospitality of the Palestinians, and secondly, we were invited to a number of family situations, and we would go thinking that we would just meet the immediate family, but grandparents would show up, and cousins, and young and old. It was amazing to see how these families came together whenever they hosted someone. Next person, Alice Rothchild.
So first of all, my experiences studying this region, are totally in keeping with everything you have described. But I wanted to just briefly talk about how I got into this and then what I saw. So I grew up in a very traditional Jewish household, Hebrew school, Orthodox grandparents in Brooklyn, bat mitzvah, family pilgrimage to Israel when I was 14, a place that a lot of Americans come from. Being a child of the 60s, I also got a very different political view of the world as I grew up. And then in the 1990s, I felt I had to bring my childhood self and my adult self together into one whole piece. And I started doing work around Jewish-Palestinian dialogue, and then starting in 2003, began organizing annual health and human rights delegations to Israel, the West Bank, and to Gaza. And organizing these delegations, which I've done annually basically since then, really gave me a window not only into working in solidarity with Jewish Israelis who refuse to be enemies with Palestinians, as well as with Palestinian clinicians. And it also gave me an opportunity to really look deeply into patients' problems, family structure, to interview people that I wouldn't normally have gotten to if I was just a tourist in the region. And so one of the very, very striking things, again, is the number of children and the amount of trauma they experience. And I had a particular interest in trauma because as a gynecologist, I worked with a lot of women who had had various kinds of trauma, so it was sort of in my brain to pay attention to that. And talking with families, talking with children, visiting prisons, talking with Adamir, which is a Palestinian rights, legal rights organization, visiting Gaza and working with the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, really helped me to see the level of trauma that children have. So either you're afraid of getting arrested or you are arrested. Those are the sort of two states of childhood. And the thing about a child who enters the Israeli detention system is not only is there a huge amount of injustice that goes on by the time the kid gets out, but many of the families and also the clinicians talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder. And then they would say, well, it's not really post because it's ongoing. So Palestinian children have an unusually high rate of PTSD symptoms. One of the most prominent ones is bedwetting. So I would constantly hear from families that their 12-year-old or their 10-year-old was still bedwetting, and this then we'd talk back, and then this came out that it was related to some traumatic experience with a soldier. The other issue that came up with families a lot was that children who saw their parents humiliated by soldiers, which happens, every day at a checkpoint, or children who were arrested and saw that their fathers couldn't protect them, became very disrespectful to their fathers because their fathers lost their power. And so one of the sort of side effects of all of this horrendous stuff that we're learning about is the attack on the structure and the strength of the Palestinian family. Because if children feel that they cannot be protected by the adults in their life, then they don't have any respect for them. And why should they? The soldier came and dragged them out, and the father just sat there and wasn't able to stop the soldier, who is often the same age as the person, or maybe 2 years older than the person that they're arresting. So there's a really terrible dynamic that gets set up in the family structure as well as with the children who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And the other thing I just want to put a pitch in for, as an American citizen, it is very often our weaponry that is being used during these arrests. And so the guns that the soldiers are carrying, the tear gas that gets thrown at the kids, it actually says made in the US. It's not a subtle connection how we are connected to this and how we are responsible for this. So I think whenever you throw your hands up and say this is hopeless, I can't do anything, you've got to remember that we are really complicit in making this happen and in making this continue. And I'll just end with reminding everybody that Obama just agreed to $3.8 billion a year in military aid, all to be used to buy our weaponry. So we're really in this up to our noses, and that's another reason why when we get to the part about political action, we need to take this seriously if we have a sense of morality and a sense of an understanding of human rights. Thank you.
And you did say 3.8 billion. Oh, per year for 10 years. Okay. All right, John.
Thank you. I'm John McKay, and I've had the privilege of speaking to many of you. I recognize so many and know a lot of you here. So many know that I spent 2 years, 2013 to 2015, in Ramallah, directing the U.S. government's Rule of Law project, working with the Palestinian Authority. But hearing Alice, I really think that we should put doctors and lawyers together more often, and not just in court, because she makes so much sense. And the things that she said are very large in my mind too. I mean, it's really hard to come in here and with people who care about this issue and care for the human rights of Palestinians and realize that my country just agreed to give a prosperous first world country $38 billion that belong to us to buy weaponry, which will be used in the first instance to maintain a heartless, human rights depriving occupation of Palestine. I mean, that's just difficult to take. My observations, but to go to the law side, because we've heard a couple from sort of clinical and medical side, but human rights are wrapped up in all of these things. There's no question. But we're working and talking about a place that is almost it's almost mythical when it comes to power imbalance and the purpose of the power imbalance, which is to maintain an occupation, the purpose of which is to seize the land. And so the need to maintain order within that mission, if you think of it as a mission for the IDF, for the Israeli military and all of their security services, they must maintain order. And so we're seeing, I think, in these pictures what happens when an occupying force in a land which they don't belong, and I realize that may not be shared by all, but certainly a land in which they're not recognizing the rights of the people who are there first. Let's put it that way. It requires incredible intervention in daily lives. And in my experience, in my relatively limited time, 2 years, I closely observed, on behalf of the U.S. government in many instances, intrusions by the IDF into refugee camps and into Palestinian-controlled cities, including the Palestinian Authority. And they were often middle-of-the-night intrusions by IDF. And in almost every case, when you learned about the details, the military were there to arrest children. My first few weeks that I was present in Ramallah, the IDF came into Kalandia in the middle of the night to make an arrest. And it takes a long time to figure out who they were arresting, but I'm a little bit persistent, and I'm a lawyer. And it wasn't in the newspaper articles, but we learned they were arresting 2 15-year-old boys. And they thought that they would simply come in, kick the door in, and pull these boys out of bed while their family was screaming and take them out quickly. But only about 5 or 6 soldiers came in. They came in by stealth. But as they left the home, they found about 40 Palestinian men standing outside waiting for them, arms folded, unarmed, and the soldiers decided to shoot their way out because they had, I'm sure assured their commanders that they would get in, take these 2 15-year-old boys, and get out, no problem. Well, there was a problem, and in the end, of course, the media in Israel said that that petrol bombs were thrown at them, knives were used, and my favorite was that they threw a refrigerator on them, pushed a refrigerator off a roof onto the soldiers. Now, anyone who's been there knows that no Palestinian would waste a refrigerator in this way, and I don't mean to be disrespecting of the lives involved. I just mean they wouldn't waste a refrigerator like that. There's no question. So the lies that get told when this occur. But I think the important thing is that in these instances where we see what's happening, the children are almost always involved. It wasn't within my mission to be engaged at all with the Israeli justice system. Nor was it my role to be directly involved in the military court system. So the Ofra camp, which abuts Ramallah, is one of the places where the military courts take place. But I would go there on occasion to observe. And they were supposed to be public, but they did not really want me there at all. And when I would show my official American passport, they wouldn't like that very much, to see an American official unaccompanied in Ramallah. I was allowed to live in Ramallah. The average age when they would bring the prisoners out was about 16. I don't think I ever saw like a full-grown, 21-year-old or older person brought out from the military prisons. I spoke to many families as they waited for their children to be brought out, and these were boys. I mean, they would come out and they'd say, they'd call to their parents, I need some new tennis shoes, and they'd be laughing, and like, give me some tennis shoes, because they were in prisons and being rotated out in the military prison. So very, very striking. And I said average age. There were often 12-year-olds and 11-year-olds and 10-year-olds standing in the dock that were being brought out from these prisons. Almost any time you see photographs of arrests that are occurring, I think there are a number in your photos and also in the documentary we watched, you see children being handcuffed with plastic handcuffs and taken away. While I was there, they passed a new law, mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years for throwing stones at soldiers. So there is no age limit on that. Now, if you think that the American justice system has problems with juvenile justice, and we do, you can't even imagine. There is no distinction made for juveniles in the Israeli military court system. And so they're handcuffed and they are taken away. I heard one boy shouting, Ustez, 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 and it was later reported that he was calling help, 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 but this means teacher. They had pulled him from his schoolyard and they were arresting him and they were putting the plastic handcuffs on him and he could barely stand up. You know why? Because he had every book that he used for school in his backpack. And he was saying to the soldiers in Arabic, look at my hands, they're not dirty, I threw nothing, and he was calling for his teacher. So you see this in almost every case. I think this conference is really important. It's not, you wouldn't want to say that there was an exploitation of children to try to win an issue. This is an issue that is just deeply wrapped in this human rights concern. And the use by IDF military, by IDF, by Israeli security forces of children to try to convert them to be sources of information through intimidation has been well documented. If you want to, you should look at the Israeli or the Australian documentary. I think it's called Stone Cold Justice. Look that up on YouTube, Stone Cold Justice, and you'll see this is mainstream Australian media, well-documented instances of torture and psychological intimidation to try to make children as young as 8 and 9 inform on what's happening in their villages. This is a very hard to take version of human rights violations in my judgment.
I want to give Brad an opportunity to comment or ask any questions. We want to have a conversation here for a while among us.
So I'm actually interested to hear from John a bit about being in the military courts in Ofra and sort of how it compares from your perspective as an American lawyer litigating in courts here in the US, being a prosecutor, thinking about that role and sort of what you expected before you went to Ofra and how that expectation was, how that transpired and how you left. Because we bring lawyers on delegations to Ofra and Salem, and it's one of the most profound moments because you realize how. I'll let you talk, but.
One other question about that. It's my understanding that although the interrogations may be in Arabic, that all the court proceedings are in Hebrew, so that the children don't actually know what's going on. Is that true? You can add that to the...
It's a good question, because the question is whether Hebrew is sort of forced on them. No, the answer is no. Oftentimes, the court personnel usually it would be a Druze translator that was translating. So yeah, there was translation, but it was either in Hebrew or sometimes English. I would hear English in the courtroom, but it was difficult. They were soldiers providing, in most cases, the translation. And there would be one or two lawyers, and they would be Palestinian with Israeli bar license, so they were Israeli lawyers, but Palestinian. And they were doing the representation. All of them that I ever encountered, and there were many, were extremely overworked. But I found very committed to these youths that were brought out from the prisons at various times. So I thought it was Guantanamo when I got there. And you know, as an American, as really the only American official there connected to the justice system in any way, I carried this over me like a Peanuts cartoon, a black cloud over my head, because here I am training Palestinians on how to have their own state. Thank you for laughing. Someone laughed at that. The idea that we would be holding ourselves up, or I would hold myself up as an expert, and I come from a country that is conducting military court commissions in Guantanamo. But it was physically like Guantanamo. There were trailers. You've been to Ophir, you know what it's like. You have to go through the most amazing set of security and steel, and it was like a federal high security prison to get into the Ophir. But once you got in there were like school portables, and the conditions were pretty terrible. I'll give you a quick example. The presiding officer one day in Ophir I thought she was quite capable in all ways as the presiding judge in a military uniform, of course. These are military courts now. And these kids see this. This isn't a judge in black robes. It was an IDF captain sitting up there who was in judgment over these boys being brought out from the prison. Her father had been killed. Do you know who I'm talking about? Her father had been killed. He was the Attorney General of Israel and had been killed in a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. And I will tell you, speaking with the family members, they were all petrified that this woman, this judge, would be sitting in judgment of their children having had that experience. An example of what happens when you're there. But I thought about Guantanamo. I thought about how little trappings that you had of justice, let alone actual justice. And there was almost no one there who felt like they were in a position to have a fair opportunity to have justice issued. They were simply hoping, most of the families were just hoping to see their children, because many had come, and often they would say, oh no, your child's not at this court, they're at another court, because they don't know where they are. They're kept in prisons in Israel in the desert. They don't know where they are.
I also wanted to speak to the whole issue of children throwing stones. There's actually a big psychiatric literature in Palestine about this issue, because throwing stones, if you think about it, the kids are throwing stones at a wall, at a tank, at a totally armed Israeli soldier. Clearly, stones can cause harm, but the discrepancy between a kid throwing a stone and a wall or a tank is enormous. And one of the things I've heard from psychiatrists is that throwing a stone is a very sort of historically powerful act, and it's also a very psychologically powerful act. It's an act of saying, this land is mine and I'm holding it in my hands. And I think that we shouldn't forget the power of that act for a kid. I mean, is it healthier for a child to just submit to a really oppressive situation? Or is it healthier for a child to stand up and say, I'm not going to submit, and the only way they know how to do that is to throw a stone? So I think it's important to think about the psychology of that particular act, and then it comes with this massive punishment if they're caught, or even if they're not caught.
In your experience as a social work here in the States, have you worked with refugees who have come out of Palestine and worked with children who have had these kinds of experiences? Or would you have a story specifically of a family who has dealt within the family with children who have been traumatized by detention?
Actually, I can't think of a particular family situation where that is the case here in the States. more, okay. Here in the States, what I've worked with families who've been traumatized by being forced to immigrate because of issues of such nature, to protect their kids, to protect their family members, and they had to kind of leave and be in a community where they don't really feel they belong. And that's by itself, even if, again, they're running away from a traumatic situation and they come to another place that has a whole load of different challenges and crises, so to speak. So they leave family behind, they're alienated, and they do feel like, I've remember one expression where they said it's like fish out of water when you're away from family. And that's very true to a lot of people from that community who come here. And they are forced from from this big extended family to a very nuclear family where everybody works, there is no support for the kids, there is no, the two parents who were before shared the responsibility of the parenting with multiple family members now having to do it on their own, and yet they have to work outside of their home in addition to that. So they go to schools and they don't really have the same network of support, so they get lost. And what I see, what they come for is just like, I cannot control my kids. And that's the biggest thing that I kind of hear or encounter in my clinical role. And that's been the case. It's very identical to what I used to hear from when I worked there and lived there. During after the first Intifada, where the head of the households were all in prison, so there was no authority figures in the homes, and the kids they were out of control because of the lack of supervisory, lack of authority, and also what you've heard also the other presenters saying, in terms of there is no respect to the authority figures that they have at that moment. So you end up with a very disjointed kind of family unit, and it creates a whole load of other issues that they have to deal with.
The other point that I want to add to your comments is that children's brains are different than adult brains, and it's very clear that repeated childhood trauma affects cognitive development. It affects the ability to have attention, so that these kids who've had this kind of trauma are intellectually affected and also have issues around attention and paying attention and being focused. So it affects their schooling, and so it really damns them potentially for the rest of their lives. So I think thinking about children is different than thinking about, no one should be traumatized, but children then have a whole lifelong legacy because of the cognitive development.
The one thing, the literature is really clear in terms of the impact of trauma, of kids' trauma on the brain. And like you said, yes, there is the cognitive, these are the clear factors that you see right away, which is lack of focus in schools and ability to concentrate, ability to be motivated, feeling like you are worth anything, so you feel motivated to try and excel and work to your full potential. Your education is totally disjointed, disrupted, so your potential opportunities for the future is like cut right there. And the other piece is there has been a lot of studies actually, and a very positive correlation between childhood trauma across the board and adult illnesses and diseases like diabetes, as well as heart conditions and cardiac type of issues. And that's when they get older. And that's a big one too. It's just like then you're paying for it. Like think about all the systems that goes in place to treat all those side effects or results of traumas in kids. And that goes on medical expenses, their family kind of composition, support, etc. And lack of opportunities. And they become, very helpless. They become kind of aggressive, even internal aggression, not just even outwardly. And you mentioned the rocks, and it is symbolic, but it's also as a minority. And I grew up in that kind of similar culture. It wasn't to that same extent, but it was quite similar, where as a minority, if the aggression is towards you as a group, you fight. You don't just take it. it's kind of different than individual aggression where you're just the only one, and some people as survival, they just kind of hide in a sense. So you can't just hide. There is nowhere to hide. They're out there. The threat is ongoing. You hide one day, then what? Where are you going to go? Opportunities are at minimum, at best. So you're surrounded by it, and that's your only way out, kind of. Not even out, just expression. So you're not just devastated in terms of emotionally, where you just become catatonic, more or less.
Brad, are the girls ever arrested? And secondly, the Geneva Accords, do they in any special way address the rights of children?
So the first question, yes, girls are arrested. So pre-October 2015, what my answer to this question would be is that a handful of girls, usually 1 or 2, are in detention each month. They don't necessarily experience the same widespread systematic ill treatment that boys do. In those cases, used to be sort of individual cases where a girl knew that she could go through a checkpoint with a knife or something, do something where she would be arrested, usually in close proximity to a soldier, to remove herself from a pretty terrible situation, whether it's at home with domestic violence, sexual violence. So it was more of an escape, right? October 2015, right? There was escalation in violence, and within that you saw girls kind of picking up knives, going to checkpoints, and trying to attack a soldier, right? So with that, we've seen a dramatic spike, from that 1 or 2 girls being detained at any given month to, first I think it was 4, and then 6, and then a dozen. And so it's definitely kind of smaller as a figure, right? But the trend has been increasing. So, yes. So the second piece, in international humanitarian law, children, as with most legal systems, treaties, international treaties, have special status, right? There's a recognition that children are different than adults on a various number of levels, therefore entitled to special protections. Geneva Conventions have sort of special considerations, both from a humanitarian perspective and a legal perspective. I think the most relevant piece for this issue is that children being transferred to prisons inside Israel, right? Around, any given month it could be 45% to 65% of kids, Palestinian kids arrested by Israeli forces in the West Bank, transferred to prisons inside Israel, right? That is a violation of Geneva Conventions. In the same way that you can't transfer a civilian population into occupied territory, you can't transfer occupied population outside of that territory, right? So that's ongoing. It's been ongoing since 1967 when Israeli forces occupied the West Bank, yet there's really no political will to change that situation, even though it's on its face, just the basic sort of status of that transfer is a clear violation of international law.
And just as a quick side to that, the implications of having your child in an Israeli prison in terms of family visitation. For a family to come, first of all, the Israelis severely limit which family members can come. And then they have to apply for permits, which are often very difficult to get. And oftentimes, I've spoken with families who've been through this. They'll get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's usually done through the Red Cross, I believe. So they've already gone through hell and high water to get the permit. They get up really early, then they wait for the Red Cross buses to come. The buses come, they travel for hours, and then they have to go through an intense security check to get into the prison. And then they'll have 45 minutes with their son, who is behind glass walls. There's no touching. And then they do the return visit. And maybe they do that every 3, 6, 12 months. It has other implications besides, it's against Geneva.
The next question I want to direct to Alice. and others might have insights to offer as well. The one is the media. The media coming out of Israel is always very quick in responding to a situation like a stabbing or whatever. The Palestinian media may come later, but I'm guessing usually does not come at all unless someone picks it up somewhere, maybe who's visiting with Palestinians. Could you speak to the question of media? And then a related question, do you know of Israeli activists in Israel? What's the difference between activism in Israel and Jewish activism in America in relation to Palestinian rights?
So 7 hours later, I will have finished answering. So the first issue is how are things picked up by the media? And so you mean US media versus? Okay. So first of all, there is what I would call mainstream media, which we all know is basically owned by large corporations that have certain interests and certain stakeholders and that kind of thing. And most mainstream media adheres to a particular narrative. And the particular narrative is that, you know, Israel's a democracy, it's doing the best it can in a dangerous neighborhood, it has to defend itself, and what it does is okay. And, you know, sometimes those squirrely Palestinians get out of hand, and you just got to whack them around and get them back in shape. And that's basically the tale that's told about a lot of interactions. If you go like 1 inch below that, because we do have internet, we do have Democracy Now!, we do have Mondoweiss and Electronic Intifada and Al Jazeera and a host of other ways to know what's going on, you can actually learn the complexity of what's going on. But you have to take that little teeny baby step to do it, and most people don't. I'm not 100% sure what you mean by Palestinian media not picking something up. There are all sorts of media organizations within Palestine, either coming from media or coming from human rights organizations or you know, journalists and that kind of thing. And mostly in Palestine, everybody knows what's going on. I mean, first of all, you don't have to read the media to know what's going on because it's going on in your village. But if the problem is that that media is not seen by Western media as worth listening to. So this has to do with the narrative and the framing. And as long as we live within a particular narrative and framing, we're really unable to easily, unless we take that little step, hear beyond it. But it's all there. It's more, you know, how the discourse is framed, and then everything kind of fits into that discourse. So that's the short answer. In terms of the US Jewish left versus Israeli left, okay. So in the US Jewish community, there is a strong and growing progressive community that is really challenging what I would call the narrative or the framing that we all grew up with, and is trying to address the issue that Palestinian narrative, Palestinian human rights, Palestinian historical, Palestinian history is not acknowledged within our political framework. And so groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which tripled in size during the last Gaza war. There's If Not Now, which was a group of students who challenged mainstream Jewish organizations during the Gaza war about their lack of caring and attention to the deaths of Palestinians. There's a group coming out challenging Hillel, which is the campus-wide group that provides a Jewish home for Jewish students on campuses, that's challenging Hillel leadership, that refuses to allow discourse that challenges the framing. There's a lot of activity going on in the United States within the Jewish community. Also with the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, if you look at who's the leadership of that movement in the United States on a lot of campuses, it's your local Jewish students. So the Jewish community, although the mainstream Jewish community is in one place, there is a growing and I would say powerful Jewish progressive movement challenging the framing. In Israel, there was a progressive movement that was tuned in. It used to be a very radical idea to have a two-state solution. When I started this work, that was like, whoa, you can barely say that. And so that sort of peaked with the Oslo agreements in 1993. And for a lot of Israeli leftists, Oslo happened, everything's going to be fine, we'll have our two states, and people went home. So there was a real collapse of a lot of the progressives in Israel. And it's taken a long time, particularly because of the intifadas and because in Israel there's a real sense of being a victim and being afraid, even though they're a major military power, and that doesn't coincide with the reality of their lives. So there is a real dearth or a falling off of a lot of leftist movements. What I see now is that there are two strands of leftism or progressivism amongst Israeli Jews. One is a group that is strongly Zionist. They believe in a Jewish state. They think a Jewish state can be a democracy, but they're horrified about the occupation, and they're horrified about the siege of Gaza. And for instance, Danny Bartal, who's a famous social psychologist out of Tel Aviv, has written a lot about societies in conflict. He's heading a whole thing about it's the 50th anniversary of the occupation coming up. We need to end the occupation. So there's that movement. And then there's a teeny weeny group who are challenging the idea of Zionism, who are challenging the idea that it is best for Jews to live in a Jewish-only state that is privileges itself over all of the other folks who either live as citizens or live in the neighborhood. So that's a tiny strand of Israeli leftism, but also a powerful one. And those folks see themselves as working in solidarity with Palestinians rather than as the leaders. So those are the folks that go to the rallies to fight the wall and that march with villages who have lost their water to settlements and walk with them as Jewish Israelis challenging the occupation, but in a very more fundamental way. So I would say those are the two strands of leftism that I see in Israel.
John, you spoke at some length, but I'd like to hear more, about working with Palestinian lawyers, people working on government and those kinds of things. Could you tell another story of that one-to-one contact with a student who's really wanting to help their society and learn how to govern themselves, govern the people. Is there more you can say about that? How receptive are they to your ideas as an American? What did you see them latching on to?
Well, I certainly found that among students, the young women in Palestine were incredibly dedicated. In particular, I'm not sure why I'm singling that out, but even more striking than here in the United States, I saw more women in Palestinian law schools. I think there are 6 or so Palestinian law schools. Probably the leading one at Birzeit outside of Ramallah, but also in Nablus, also in Hebron. I mean, there is a great investment happening in the law in Palestine, and that's not a story being told here at all. By the way, I mean, I don't think it's a story in the West until it's written by the New York Times or covered by the BBC. Anything else that's happening, like the little story I told you about the refrigerator, that was widely reported in the Palestinian news. I knew it was true because I talked to eyewitnesses. But it was also being reported in the Palestinian news. That's just not news until it gets covered by the New York Times or the BBC. But I think there's a great interest in the law. There's a great interest in believing that one day there will be a Palestinian state. The question is, how are they going to get there? I'll tell you a little story. I got to work with Palestinian law students in international moot court competition. So international moot court would train law students in how to argue in international law, and in particular in front of international fora. And it came to be that my program was in charge of training for 2 years Palestinian law students and running a competition that then sent them to Washington, D.C. Now consider that one of the great fears, I think, among Zionist Israelis is that Palestinians will one day have full access to international forums like the ICC, like perhaps war crimes, if war crimes were ever found to occur, which I think did occur in Gaza, by the way, but that the Palestinians have no forum and no lawyers and no ability to prosecute those. So when I spent US funds to train students in international moot court, I would sort of quietly tell my Palestinian colleagues we're actually training people to sue Israel in the future in international courts. And if the Israelis only knew what we were doing, they would not be as enthusiastic as the Palestinians were. By the way, the Palestinian women who won the competition from Birzeit and then went to Washington, D.C. received standing ovation after standing ovation in Washington as they argued among their colleagues from around the world because they argued in English. Can you imagine that many used translation, but they argued these very complex international rules in English. I admired them so greatly. So there's a commitment to the rule of law. I consider their engagement to be really at the highest level, that they understand this. Those who are working in the law, whether as prosecutors or defense lawyers, I worked mostly with prosecutors. They think there will be a state one day, but no one really believes anymore, especially young people, in a two-state solution. But there's still hope. I don't know how to describe it. There's a hope that one day still there will be, a state of Palestine. And so there's an enthusiasm for the law because they know that it's not going to happen by virtue of force of arms. And we were just talking about what it means to reach down and pick up a rock. I would tell people I saw many instances, and a few times was uncomfortably in the middle of the Shabab, the youth throwing the stones, and the IDF, literally in the middle on 2 occasions when I was there. But I used to say, well, Major League Baseball should come and see some of these boys because they're getting really good with the stones. But the power imbalance is obvious, and so you can see why they would turn and put their hope in the law. And so I get some satisfaction in that with this training, with this commitment, in particular the young women in Palestine who I found very dedicated to this idea that one day they would have an opportunity to stand in front of the world and argue that these conventions have been violated, that human rights have been deprived, and I think they will one day stand, and with a Palestinian flag behind them, they're going to make that claim, inshallah, right?
In our planning, the question was raised, you may go away from this place with some of the presentation just really downhearted. And we don't want that to happen. And so I was glad to see that many of you asked questions. What can we do to change things? One question specifically, or actually there were 2 of them, dealt with Zionist Christians. What can we do as evangelical Christians or whatever Christian background we come from to influence the Zionist mentality among some of our churches? Related to that is how can we have impact on our government to change policies that would help bring peace and help bring to light the need to change this government that is so oppressive to children. I would like to open this up to anyone here who wants to speak to this.
So on the church side, there's a number of organizations like Kairos USA, Israel and Palestine Mission Network, and the Presbyterian Church that are creating resources to bring these issues to your congregation generally, to address sort of the key issues that churches and congregations have in discussing these issues. And Jennifer will talk more specifically about the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, but this was created exactly as a tool to both educate your friends, your neighbors, your communities, and also provide a path for action, right? Directed at members of Congress as a way to raise a specific narrow issue that's compelling so that there's space created to talk about Palestinian rights from a rights-based perspective, instead of the varied non-rights-based perspectives that have sort of dominated the Israel-Palestinian issue over the past several decades. So we'll talk a bit more about specifics, but to know that there are resources out there specific to faith-based groups, particularly U.S. churches, and there's a lot of work going on. I was just in Washington the beginning of this week, I think. I've been traveling a bit, so I'm fuzzy. The Monday and Tuesday this week, and it was church leadership from many of the mainstream Protestant groups, some of the black churches, and it was a really interesting discussion. They're coming together to figure out how they can use their power with their membership to really push on this issue, both on an education front, but also on our policymakers. So I think there'll be more as folks demand within their congregations that this is a priority for yourself, and I think just being heard can really have an impact, because there's processes starting that will hopefully really leverage the power that American churches and congregations have, so that this issue is addressed in a comprehensive way, not just in sort of the rhetoric that comes out around the Holy Land, but concrete, practical impact.
And also for the church community, I would really recommend you reading the books by Mark Braverman. His famous one is Fatal Embrace, written by a Jewish person addressing the Christian community about Christian guilt about this whole thing, but it's also he's a very powerful writer on this topic. You also mentioned African American churches, and this brings up the whole issue of intersectionality that's going on, where people are realizing that there are things that are going on in both places that are parallel. So, for instance, I find when I'm speaking with African Americans that oftentimes people are more religious and take a more literal interpretation of the Bible, but they recognize racism when they see it. And when I say, well, I've been in Hebron and there are streets that are Jewish-only streets, and I've visited families where they can't go out their front door because it's a Jewish street, and they have to go up to the roof and go down a ladder to get out of their house, and their kids get rocks thrown at them by little Jewish kids, and the parents cheer them on, they say, oh my God, that's Birmingham in 1950. So there are ways to connect that I think are very powerful, that skip the politics, just call this what it is. And so I think that that's another way to organize around this.
What was the name of that book again?
Fatal Embrace.
Fatal Embrace, Mark Braverman. I have a question way back here. I'll go ahead and take it.
I just want to call attention to the fact that just recently the Lutheran Church, the entire organization of the Lutheran Church, passed a resolution opposing aid and occupation, and I think that's really powerful, and I think that's what all the denominations in this country, anybody that's part of a denomination, should look at this and model this, because that's power.
It has been significant over the last several months. The Methodist Church, United Church of Christ, Episcopal Church, and I know others are taking action similar to this. You mentioned African American identification with the Palestinian plight. It was really interesting to me to notice in the news coming out of Native Americans in North Dakota identifying their solidarity with Palestinians and what it feels like to be conquered, taken over by society here in America. I have one little story in my family history. My mother's side, there are about 6 or 7 of them who served in the American Revolution. And I have tried to track their records, and at least half of them moved from Pennsylvania or Maryland into Ohio because they got a land grant. And why did they get a land grant in Ohio? Because this was 1800, soon after, when the American policy was to occupy the northwest areas, Ohio, Indiana, and that's where I feel like I have personal responsibility. I have benefited from land that my ancestors received, taken over from Native Americans, stolen, conquered, what all that.
And I should say that it goes the other way. The Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Group in Palestine just released a statement in solidarity with the Native Americans fighting the pipeline. So Palestinians see it and Native Americans see it. It's going both ways. It's not a subtle finding. Yeah.
Let's not forget my people, the Irish. If you travel in Ireland, if you go in any city there, you will see, as I did during the time of the assault on Gaza, Palestinian flags flying in many homes, people with Palestinian flags painted on their faces, nothing like what you would see here during this time. And it took me a while to figure it out, and I thought, well, of course, the Irish were occupied people. They immediately identify with Palestinians. I think something that's really missing here is the Palestinian diaspora, which is highly successful in places like Peru and in Chile, in the United States, in Canada, coming together and creating a voice for the abuse that's happening in Palestine. I think there's been remarkable success in business and in each of these places. I've been to Peru and I visited with the Palestinian community. They're highly successful, but it's almost as if it's too painful for them to sort of grasp. And it's also very difficult for them to return to Palestine because if they return with a Palestinian name, I've actually been on the receiving end of this, they are treated as if they never left by the Israelis when they try to come into Palestine. Even if they haven't been there in 2 generations, they're treated in this way. So I do think that I think it's a criticism of those who want to support Palestinian rights, that Palestinians, the diaspora have not organized as well as one would have hoped to try to counteract at least the misinformation of what is happening to Palestinian rights.
And also with the whole issue of the media and framing and tying it into intersectionality. I don't know if you saw a couple of days ago, there was this puff piece in the New York Times about how Israel used our Declaration of Independence as a model for their, and so was it Jody Roderin or whatever her name is, was saying, they're like our little sister and they're in our image and blah, blah, blah. She neglected to say that, we were founded with manifest destiny and slavery and dispossession of Native Americans, and that's also parallel in Israel, but she missed out on that little piece of the parallels.
Okay, I see a hand over here.
It's all really up to you. I'm glad and I really appreciate what you've done. But John McKay mentioned imbalance. And that comes really clear when we hear Netanyahu, I think it was September 9th, 2-minute video. He declares removal of Israelis and Aliyah Jews from the West Bank is ethnic cleansing. How are we going to contend with that? Is it going to get worse there? He's saying these things because he has to appeal to the politics of Israel to stay in office.
Okay, John, do you want to speak to that, or anyone?
Okay, do you want to rephrase it?
Yeah, I think you're referring to those. Was this the statement that had to do with the illegal? With yeah.
So Netanyahu, in his what's called Israeli Hasbara, which is a propaganda campaign, puts out these English language videos that are not for Israelis, they're for us. And his last one said that anyone who opposed Jewish settlement in the West Bank was in favor of ethnic cleansing of Jews. So he's flipping the language. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought it was a bit more complicated than that. That's just so blatantly, propagandist that it's hard to even fathom. I mean, when you go there, I saw so many hands go up of people who visited, and if you were able to go anywhere beyond Bethlehem and see the settlements, which you can see in Bethlehem as well, it's a shocking event for most Americans and I know my visitors in my 2-year time to see these settlements, just what they're called, they're settlements. So the idea that you would forcibly place these people in lands that are not theirs and then claim that, if the time comes when they have to leave. I say if because, behind those walls, the settlers are heavily, heavily armed. I never saw a settler outside of the walls of the settlement without a 9mm in the small of their back, including swimming in a swimming hole. I don't think 9mm pistols are the only thing that are behind those walls. I'll tell you what, I would not want to be the IDF lieutenant or captain or major who had to go clear out a settlement if and when there was ever a resolution that involved settlers going back to Israel. They put them there for a reason, and the reason is to take the land. If they ever take them back, it's going to be because they cut some deal brokered by the United States where they keep Jerusalem and a bunch of other settlements. And those people who are in those settlements, they've been, some are in their third generation now, living inside the settlements. I would hate to be the soldier responsible for going in to the settlement and saying, you can't live here anymore. I mean, talk about in terms of relative pain, this is what they've been saying to the Palestinians who go back hundreds of years in the land and can look at the olive trees and know that they've been in their family for hundreds of years. And for the Jewish settlers, it will be only 3 generations. But that is a gigantic problem created by Israel, and Mr. Netanyahu has thoroughly endorsed it and funded it. So for him to say that it will be ethnic cleansing is a, gosh, I don't even want to say the word that wants to come out of my mouth. It's a kind of lie. It's kind of like effing.
Well, it is exactly a quarter after. I'll take one more question.
Yes, you've been government and attorney general for literal what does the U.S. government, in your view, know of this very issue, for example, child abuse in Israel? Does the government, Congress, does anybody really in Washington, D.C. understand what we just heard?
I see Brad wanting to speak to that.
So they know a lot, right? I mean, the problem isn't lack of information. It's complete lack of political will to address the situation comprehensively, not just this issue, every issue, right? Anything that would be a measure or even a statement that could be construed as trying to hold Israel accountable to some type of minuscule international law standard, there's just no political will to do that, right? And on this specific issue, there's, every year the State Department releases an annual human rights report. And this report is a huge, robust report that goes through every country on earth and looks at the human rights situation in that country. Since 2007, 2008, this issue, specific to ill treatment, detention of Palestinian children, has been in the State Department's report each year, repeatedly. And that's our own government documenting, searching out information, including it and compiling it in an annual report, right? So it's not information. We at DCI Palestine, we work closely with the consulate in East Jerusalem, sharing information. We have occasionally Palestinian American children arrested by the Israeli forces, charged in the military courts. The consulate is very interested in that. And then, even if it doesn't involve a U.S. citizen, they'll be interested in sort of the more high-profile cases. But when it comes to Washington, there's really no political will to address the situation. We created this campaign as a way to do a better job of specifically asking these narrow questions of policymakers to get them on the record. Because, as a Palestinian organization, for a long time why would we engage with members of Congress? What's the point of engaging with the State Department? From a Palestinian perspective, everything is against you. It's futile. But then, sort of as we saw the growing movement in the U.S. Among sort of the younger demographic who view the issues in the conflict more through a rights-based perspective, instead of the sort of the political conundrum as it's presented, typically, we saw an opportunity to really take specific issues, bring them, press members of Congress, and get them on the record. And it doesn't matter if they say yes or no. Right? I mean, you see all these issues. Ideally, we would want a member of Congress to say that, yeah, I think solitary confinement of a 12-year-old child solely for interrogation purposes is wrong. We would like them to recognize that, right? And if they do, as we had, just this past July, 20 members of Congress signed on to a Dear Colleague letter, essentially saying something along those lines. But for the rest of them, right? The other 415, if they say no, we don't agree with you, really that's just as good for where we're at, right? Because the idea is that Congress is probably going to be the last to change. The executive is going to be the last to change policy, right? We have to mobilize and organize to force them to change. And so what's happening in the U.S., you know, we've tried to situate this campaign within that broader movement, is that citizens are mobilizing. They're saying, we don't support military aid to Israel. We don't support the grave human rights violations that the Palestinians are living under. We don't support a nearly 50-year military occupation. And members of Congress are slowly sort of seeing that. And I think, you know, if you look and sort of track the issue when it comes to policymakers, the Democratic Convention was an interesting moment. Compared to the 2012 election in convention, Palestinian rights really weren't there, right? At all. This year, they were. Whether it was the Democratic Platform Drafting Committee, where there was a prominent discussion about Palestinian rights from a rights-based perspective to get issues included in that, or if it was at the convention itself, where a number of delegates were holding "I support Palestinian rights" signs throughout the hall. So it is changing, and I think we can't expect members of Congress to sort of just listen and say, yeah, right? We need to mobilize, and we need to do our part to push them to take the position that we need them to, and the Palestinians need them to, and ultimately Israelis need them to as well. So I'll stop there. Has NPR dealt with it? Has any media dealt with this issues? And the question, I mean, generally is yes. We have resources on the website. Should they highlight it more? Should it be more prevalent? Yes.
The real question is why? Because what you're saying is very true, but why? That's the real question. Why is there no political will? Well, that's right, but why? Yeah, because we're not doing our job. Because this is our news. This is everybody believes what they see. They don't travel, so they don't know. You know. So we're being fed this information, and then we believe it.
Okay, so how many people in this room have sent a letter or called their congressman this week about this issue? How many? This week, 2 people, 3 people. If this was a room full of Israel supporters and I asked you that question, how many of you called? It would be half the room. You know, we can blame the media, but it's on us. It's on us to do our job. Okay? So, I mean, you know, we can say it's everyone else's fault, but it has to start with us. Wear your button. Go to the grocery store, and when somebody says, what's that about, engage that conversation. We have to be, if we care about changing this issue, we have to do this every day, every week. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, all of you. I mean, I know I haven't covered a lot of your questions, but thank you for participating. And thank the panel for their expertise. Mary.
So we'll just wait 1 more minute. So if you'll just, we'll take just 5 more minutes, quick. Holt, if you'll bear with me, we'll take just a few minutes and sort of, okay. So everybody in their packet has this sheet. It says engage with us. Right. So on behalf of the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, these are the sort of actions that you can take, the things that you can do, possibilities for getting you thinking about how you can raise these issues with your community. So this is one example. right? This came out of a gathering last year in Colorado, where Jennifer and I came, talked about the issues, and basically said exactly these things. Mary and Huda were there and said, we're going to bring this back to our community. And here we are, right? So we can do this together. There's a number of different things you can do. So we want you to look at this sheet, and I can go through some of this quickly with you. So the campaign focuses specifically on Congress, right? It might seem like a tall task, and it is, right? But we pay taxes. We give Israel $38 billion a year now, or every 10 years. And that's our money, right? We have a say in how it's spent, and our member of Congress has to listen to us. They might not agree, but we want to go in and make the space to raise Palestinian rights, right? Because sometimes what we hear from offices when we do the congressional work is that even many are sympathetic. They've been there, they take delegations, usually they're pro-Israel sort of funded delegations, but they see glimpses, and they read the reports the State Department has. They know, right? What some of them will say, if they're sympathetic, is that I'm sympathetic, I would sign this letter, I would do this, but I don't have any constituents that this is a priority. And they tell us to go mobilize in their district and get constituents to push them to do it. So everybody can set up a meeting with their member of Congress. We have a number of resources. We have an advocacy toolkit that tells you what to expect from a meeting, how to set up a meeting, who to contact, and then basic sort of talking points to sort of run the meeting, right? Go in, make a small pitch, raise the issues, thank you, follow up, done. The film you saw, right? We created that as a resource for people to use and share, to raise the issues with their family, whoever it might be. It doesn't have to be a production, where you have 75, 80 people in a room, a number of speakers. It could be a small gathering in the basement of your church, where you say, does anybody want to come watch this film with me? We have a study guide that goes along with the film, so instead of having Jennifer or I or any of the other speakers, you can have sort of a guided discussion based on the study guide. So that's also a resource to accompany the film to create space to talk about these issues. The Night Raid photo exhibit is something that was created that is meant to sort of bring an artistic form to the issues, to engage other members of the community that might not show up for a film screening or for a talk on Palestine. There's more details in the sheet or a link for more information if you are interested. May 2017, I'll be leading a delegation that is with the Interfaith Peace Builders, and the delegation itself will focus on Palestinian prisoners, particularly child prisoners. So if you haven't been, I know a lot of people have been, if you haven't been, I encourage you to join and go. And if there's people that you meet, people that you talk to, that you want to be more engaged or to see these issues for themselves, you can point them towards that delegation. And all the other delegations that, there's more and more delegations going every year, particularly Americans. The last plug is our website. We created a website specific for the campaign. It's simple, but has a number of different resources and updates. So if you're looking for what the situation is for Palestinian kids, we produce through, it's mostly Defense for Children International Palestine content. So information that we're gathering on the ground from our field workers goes into sort of our process, and we push out information all the time. So if it's a 15-year-old boy that was shot, like happened yesterday, there's a brief news alert up there to talk about the situation, whatever that particular case was, and then it presents a little bit of the broader context. In 500 words, the resources that you can read to inform yourself, but you can print off and bring to your church, the next barbecue, whatever it might be, to share with people. So use our website and use us, right? I'm here in the US representing a Palestinian organization because that Palestinian organization thinks it's important that you know what's happening on the ground. So use us as a resource. Jennifer and I, are always available. So if you're thinking about doing something like this, something smaller, or if you have questions that you don't know the answers to, we've pretty much confronted everything and had a response. So we can help.